Welcome to Humanist Views, a program where we look at current issues from a humanist point of view. I'm Scott Lohman. On tonight's program, we're going to take a look at a national organization as well as a new chapter that's forming here locally that takes a look at the issues regarding church-state separation. Now, most people don't give that a whole lot of thought, but when you come at it from a humanist and an atheist point of view, come to realize the importance of where religion's role is in our society and where we need to have a strictly secular role in our society. And Americans United has been a watchdog for that for many, many years, and now we're finally going to get a local chapter here, and we're quite excited about that. So joining me on tonight's program are two gentlemen from Americans United of Minnesota, and we're going to talk about their chapter as well as the national chapter. So welcome David Pacheco and Eric Stumney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So tell me about, let's start with the national organization. Tell me about Americans United for the Separation of Church and State.
Well, the national organization was formed in 1947. Right now there's about 60 state chapters. And essentially it's a nonpartisan educational organization that is dedicated to preserving church and state separation principles. They also do lobbying, and sometimes they do litigation when they need to.
Okay. So since we've got the basics, what is the importance of having church-state separation?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, it's very important from a humanist and from an atheist perspective, but it was actually formed by a quite broad coalition of religious groups in response to what was at the time an attempt to Christianize the government a little bit more. And it's really relevant to religious and non-religious groups, because one of the things that is guaranteed by the Constitution is that separation, to say the secular world provides secular law, the religious world has religious faith rights, certain rules that they follow, and the two should not be mixed. The government is there to provide the secular mandate and to provide the laws that can be guaranteed or can be given rationale for secular reasons. And to allow for people to celebrate their own religious faiths or lack of faith, you need to have the government not involved and not promoting and not condemning and not pushing forward or holding back any particular faith over another.
So it needs to maintain a neutral stance
Absolutely.
On where it is on religion. A lot of critics of our side of it like to say, oh, the phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. So where do we find that, just to show them, yeah, while that's not in there, the principle is very firmly in the Constitution?
The principle is, there are a lot of things that are not explicitly said with those words in the Constitution. I mean, we believe in a right to privacy. We believe in a fair trial. All of these are concepts that don't exist. Those words per se do not exist, but as an interpretation of the words, it's pretty clear what the original intent was. For those and many other rules. And there are other texts as well that we use to help understand what the founders at the time intended with those words. And for example, the Treaty of Tripoli is one that's referred to a lot, the letter to the Danbury Baptists. The letter to the Danbury Baptists is actually the place where the wall of separation between church and state was first mentioned, and it's survived through usage as a reference to the guarantees in the Bill of Rights. Even though those words themselves are not technically in the Bill of Rights, but that's the implication, and that was definitely the implication in the letter to the Danbury Baptists.
And Thomas Jefferson was writing that as president at
Absolutely.
the time to the Danbury Baptists, so that was what makes that more official than just say Thomas Jefferson as, emeritus person writing that letter.
And it was a guarantee or a conversation with the Danbury Baptists to help reassure them that this wall of separation would exist, that their right to celebrate their faith as they saw fit would not be something that was going to be intervened with by the government at the time. So again, it was actually a phrase that was used to provide comfort, perhaps is one way to put it, but reassurance to a religious group that their rights to celebrate their faith would not be intervened with.
So it comes in originally to protect religious
Absolutely.
rights as opposed to keeping the government or having the government support certain sects of religion.
It's both, really. It's guaranteeing that the church will not intervene in the secular affairs of government, but also that the government will not interfere in the religious rights of organized religion. So it protects both ways, and that's what we find very, very important, and that's why the associations or the groups that are associated with Americans United or that provide support for us or we join with can come from humanist organizations, from atheist organizations, but definitely also from religious organizations who want to prevent their religious freedoms from being interfered with.
Because it protects their side as well as our side on
Absolutely.
that. Because that's, an important factor that they don't seem to realize, that by protecting our rights of freedom from religion, we're protecting their rights to practice their religion as they see fit.
Or lack of religion, if they
Exactly.
They've done very well, I think, too. America is one of the most religious countries in the world. And,
Well, very religious and also very diverse with regards to its
diverse.
religion. I mean, there are countries that are more religious than the United States, but if it's one single religion that's calling all the shots and is in fact behind the entire government, then that leaves the freedom for other religions to express themselves very, very limited. So while the United States is a very, very religious country, it is also very religiously diverse for the exact same reasons. We have these protections. And when we see people who are potentially opposed to the goals of Americans United or indeed the ACLU, what they tend not to understand is the fact that they are being protected by the same rules as well. And the people who tend to be offended or tend to oppose the goals of Americans United actually tend to come from the larger religious organizations who may not see, because it is so institutionalized for them and it's such a day-to-day in everything they do, it's present. They don't actually see what it's like to be on the other side, to not be a member of that religion and be exposed to that or be forced to perform acts like prayer in public school that they may not agree with.
Yeah, and that's an important thing, because a number of those rights actually weren't started, or a number of the cases like that weren't started by humanists and atheists. They were started by minority religions who didn't want to take the prayer of the majority religion.
Yes, absolutely. And that is one of the more controversial of the cases that Americans United was involved in. And again, this was not until the middle of the 20th century when this happened, when the Supreme Court actually decided that public schools could not enforce prayer. And really, again, you'll find people taking the attitude of saying, well, that means God has been taken out of public schools. You'll find people who claim that you cannot pray, it's illegal to pray in public schools, when nothing could be farther from the truth. As long as it's private prayer, as long as it doesn't interfere with regular studies and the regular activities of the school, it's perfectly fine for children to celebrate their religious faith by praying, as long as it's not disruptive. What cannot happen is the church cannot lead that prayer, cannot be seen to promote a particular form of prayer to a particular deity for a particular religion, because that excludes any other religious group and also excludes the people who do not have religious faith. And it's a very exclusive attitude that really the government should have no role in performing.
Yeah, and that's an important factor. So why then finally are we getting and so what's the impetus for having local chapters of Americans United? What can they do that the national chapter or the national organization needs?
It's a matter of focus. There are a lot of things going on. There are a lot of bills that are introduced through the legislature. There are a lot of cases in front of the court. There are a lot of very small issues that remain very, very local. For example, starting a council meeting with a prayer, with a sectarian prayer specifically. It's something that that the national organization does not have the resources to focus on and to see everything that's going on in these tiny little meetings, which may include 5 people and be very, very specific to a very small township. So what the local chapters provide is that kind of visibility, that kind of resources, and that kind of support to make sure that these things aren't slipping under the radar. There's a lot of this type of issue that happen, and there's just too much for one single central organization based in Washington, D.C., as Americans United is, to be able to apply resources to the entire country.
Yeah, so that's going to help us locally in keeping an eye on that. What are some issues as you guys are getting started that you're looking at?
Well, the major one for this year is really our focus on the marriage amendment. We have a very strong belief that the marriage amendment is something that goes against separation of church and state because it is largely imposing a traditional religiously based definition of marriage on a very secular activity. Our position is that marriage, as it is practiced today, is actually not a religious institution at all. It's definitely not the sacred institution of marriage, as is sometimes referred to. You can get married today without the involvement of any religious figure, without any approval from any religious organization. You can get a marriage license and have the marriage ceremony, and two atheists can get married, two humanists can get married, a Catholic can get married to a person who's Jewish. Any of these combinations are perfectly allowable within the secular institution of marriage. And the rights and the responsibilities and the protections that are offered today to marriage actually come from that secular union because they are granted by the government. They are not granted by any religious organization. The right to, for example, in the state of Minnesota, the right to inherit the fishing license of your spouse should your spouse pass away. That is not granted by any religious organization. That's granted by the state.
Yep, we do that as a state because in Minnesota, that's an important thing for us to do.
It's surprisingly one of the ones that comes up the most in the state of Minnesota. There are obviously more important rights, and we do tend to make light of that particular one. But the right for a spouse to as two very important examples, things that cannot come through, in general through civil unions or domestic partnerships, the right for a spouse to make medical decisions for their spouse, the right for the spouse to be granted the body of their deceased spouse. Those are things that cannot be granted today. There are significant rights at the state and federal level, as an example, the right to file taxes as a married couple, or even something that I have been through recently, the right to gain U.S. citizenship, which you can petition on behalf of your spouse in the case of an opposite-sex marriage, but you cannot do in the case of same-sex marriage. All of these are rights and responsibilities and protections that are granted by the state to married couples. And it's our position so far with regards to this specific amendment that defining those rights to be only assigned to a couple that is approved by a religious law is completely against the separation of church and state. And that's why one of the things that we are spending a lot of time and resources on this year is helping Minnesotans United for All Families, which is the umbrella organization that we have partnered with, along with several hundred other organizations.
Including the Humanists of Minnesota.
Including the Humanists and including the Atheists of Minnesota, I believe, as well.
Yeah, Minnesota Atheists has joined them.
To help fight against that particular amendment. So we're encouraging everybody to vote no.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff going on that, so that's great that you're working on that. I know there are other issues. We had a guest in town who was talking about something called the Good News Clubs.
Yes.
And we're starting to get those in this area. Can you quick explain what they are and why we should be concerned about that?
Well, and they had a national gathering here this summer for training. And
The Child Evangelism Fellowship, which is the parent of the
Parent
organization, yes. And these organizations, we had brought out, actually asked Catherine Stewart to come out and for a couple of book signings. And they were very well attended. In fact, both of the owners said that it was probably the best, the most well attended book signings that they had. And she has written a very good book on, she had actually gone in there and gone through the training and exposed these goodness clubs for what they really are. And essentially, these goodness clubs, they go into public schools, essentially after school, and they will proselytize to children, and they try to get children to proselytize to other children. So it's sort of a very insidious situation.
It's something that Catherine Stewart refers to as faith-based bullying, because there are a lot of instances where they have told the children or provided rewards for the children to say, you must go during recess and talk to your playmates in the school, that they are going to hell, that they are disbelievers, that they are somehow sinful and evil and bad because they don't believe in the same religious figures that the Good News Club is promoting.
Yeah, so they're bringing in a very narrow version of a rather fundamentalist Christian
It is.
sect.
Extremely narrow and rather extreme, all things considered. I mean, some of the lessons, especially something that was coming up this year, and Catherine Stewart mentioned in her blog, the story of the Amalekites, which really, at the end of the day, the way they are presenting that story, and of course, biblically, these stories can be interpreted in a variety of ways. The way this particular group seems to be promoting it is, if you are told to obey God, you must do that, even if that means committing genocide. So it's a rather, at least in our opinion, rather scary organization. And the concern is really with the public schools, making sure that they have very, very clear policies about who is allowed to use the public school grounds, for example, and resources. And in the cases of the court cases that are going on right now in the state of Minnesota, additional resources such as busing the children home, giving them pamphlets to take home with them. And really the concern is about making sure that those policies are clear, that these are not organizations that are in any way promoted by the school organization, which is a very hard thing to do. And the Good News Clubs in particular make it a lot harder. They want to make these Good News Clubs feel like or seem like they are part of the school curriculum, that they are being promoted by the teachers, that they actually have the full support of the school behind them, when they really do not. The school needs to remain very, very neutral, but it's sometimes hard to do that.
Yeah, and that's especially tricky with them, because I know she mentioned in her book that they can be a very divisive thing coming in, but they want to have that big overall of, we're in the school and we're saying things from the school. They're also aiming at an age group that is still vulnerable for authority figures giving information.
And confusing whether an authority figure is speaking on behalf of the school or not, especially when they have, in many cases, volunteers who end up working at the schools and then lead these sessions after school. And the goal for that seems to be to confuse the children, who are between the ages of 4 to 14, which seems to be their target market, very easily confused about, is this person speaking to me as a school representative and therefore has the authority of the school, or are they speaking as a representative of this external organization? And especially for the younger children, that's very, very unclear.
Yeah, and that's something that should concern us on that.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that there's necessarily a counterpoint that we're doing from our end, but that would certainly be something we need to think about, as at least for a humanist point of view, as opposed to from you guys, in creating, say, critical thinking clubs and that sort of thing, that we can then bring a counterpoint.
Absolutely, and promoting something like Camp Quest is definitely one of the great responsibilities and great tasks for groups like the Humanists and the Atheists to do, providing that counterpoint. At the end of the day, in many cases, it has to do with talking to the families and talking to the parents. And in some cases, and actually Catherine Stewart has a very good suggestion with regards to clubs like these, is that schools should have a policy that any club that's going to use the school grounds and the school resources for whatever purposes, whether it's the Boy Scouts, whether it's a Good News Club, whether it's a chess club, whether it's a football club, a language club, all of them should have very, very clearly expressed goals of what they are intending to do as part of those organizations. Because we believe, especially, and Catherine Stewart also expressed this as well, that if more parents knew exactly what the ultimate goal is and what these teachings are, and the interpretation that this particular group gives to the stories in the Bible, that they would be a little less interested in sending their children to those particular groups, because it is a very extreme view. And that's why we promote the stories, for example, of the Amalekites and the way this particular group teaches those, because we believe that that is an extreme version of religion. That being said, it is a separation issue when those things get too conflated. So our issue isn't necessarily with the fact that there is a religious group teaching after school. That is perfectly okay as long as it follows policy, as long as the separation between the church and this religious organization are clearly demarked. That is actually not a problem, and many, many religious organizations use school grounds after school over the weekends. But it has to be very, very clearly separated, and that is the big concern with this particular group.
Yeah, making sure that they know this is a club, and this is after school, and this is not part of the learning. Are you also going to be keeping an eye on the state legislature when they go back into session?
Yes, again, this is one of the goals, and this is why resources for a national organization require chapters at the local level in order to be able to look at that. The amount of bills that are presented year over year, even just the ones presented, let alone the ones that actually make it into law, is vast. And a single organization can't be looking at all of those and scouring through every single one of the records. Fortunately, this is Minnesota. We are not as extreme, shall we say, as some other states that continually try to introduce issues, laws, legislation that go against the separation of church and state. As really good examples, the requirement to teach creation science, quote unquote, alongside evolution as a competing theorem in some form or fashion, and not presenting it as what it is, which is a religious story. There are several states that are trying to promote this, that are trying to put this into their curriculum. We don't seem to have that, at least as of yet, in the state of Minnesota. So we have to make sure that we're looking at those. We also have to make sure that if we're looking at public lands, that they are used appropriately, that if there are memorials being set up, that all religious groups are represented correctly, that we're not doing so in a way that excludes a particular religious group. And there are cases nationwide that Americans United has been involved in regarding crosses placed on public land to the exclusion of other religious symbols. Again, it's not about taking issue against a particular religion. Americans United is about the celebration of any religion or lack of religion that you may have, and not having your beliefs interfere with others, but definitely for the government to not be involved in whatever those religious decisions are, and not to be seen as either holding up or pushing down any particular religion or sect over above another.
Yeah, especially favoring specific versions of that. And the other good thing here in Minnesota is that we can keep a very close eye at the legislature, because as Minnesotans, we think this should be an open process. So you can sign up online or get a mailing of really well-produced things on what the legislature is up to each and every week.
And it's published on their website. It's very, very easy to search, and I encourage, by the way, everyone watching this to keep an eye on the things that are happening. And again, we don't have, the other situation I wanted to bring up was the state of Indiana, where a couple of Congress people introduced a law that would require, and the wording was rather interesting, would require starting the public school day with the Lord's Prayer. It wasn't even with a moment of silence or a moment of prayer. It was specifically with a very specific version of the Lord's Prayer. And the language, the reason I love the language of this bill was it said it was required unless somebody had an objection, which means it's not required. But it was a dog whistle type of issue. It was Congress people wanted to put this forward because they knew it was going to be turned down. It had to. It was very clearly against the separation of church and state. But then when they're up for re-election, they could go out and say, I tried to do this. I tried to, to bring religion back into our public life, and they turned me down. And that's terrible, and that's why you need to give me more money and support me and vote for me.
Oh yeah, that always makes us scary when they're doing things like that.
It's a dog whistle.
The nice thing though in Minnesota also is that we did help when the science standards were up for renewal a number of years ago by keeping an eye on those and bringing out what the other side was going to do. So that's an important thing that we can do. Is fortunately those are put together, and it's a bigger process to change those things. So we're lucky here that we don't have this small group like in some states that determines everything statewide.
Yes, and there are, even now, there are a lot of discussions going on about what should be included in the state standards or multiple state standards for education. And that's something that we definitely need to keep an eye on as well, because there are organizations, for example, in Texas, where the textbooks really that are set for the curriculum in Texas end up being the textbooks that are used much more widely than just Texas, simply because of the size of the state. The publishing organizations that produce those books will make them available to other states who will just use them. So we have to be very careful, even in Minnesota, about where our textbook discussions are happening, because it may be affected by issues that happen in other states that those discussions aren't even happening here.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. So are there some other issues that you're keeping an eye on?
Well, we do have the concert coming up. Not exactly an issue, but it is an event we wanted to promote. this is something that was organized by the national organization.
Yeah, there's Voices for United for Separation of Church and State is happening on Sunday, September 30th, from 2 to 5 p.m. At the Celtic Junction. And there's going to be folk and blues and gospel music there.
Okay, so that's happening locally here.
It's happening locally,
Yes.
yep.
And there would be information on your website on that?
Yep.
So they
we'll
can
be-
go there. And
And at au.org, which is the national organization, and mnau.org, which is the local chapter, which started just started in January.
yep, so you guys are a young organization.
Very, very young.
For your thoughts, but
And still working through the things that we're going to focus on over the course of the next few years. Definitely this year, the amendment is our major issue, and we wanted to put our resources behind Minnesotans United, and we are sending information out to our members so they can understand how they can volunteer and how they can help Minnesotans United as the umbrella organization. And at the same time, while we're putting our resources behind that this year, also looking at other issues that we're going to be focusing on after the November 6th elections, and definitely questions such as the voucher system for education, which is one of the very delicate issues, shall we say, about public school versus private school versus vouchers for very religious organizations that in most of the places where those have been put in place, the standards for the curriculum for these schools that receive the vouchers is very, very loose. And there have been several fraud cases as well involved in people who have set up these schools, receive hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money, and essentially have a church meeting every day. And that is the basis of the education for the entire time the children are there.
yeah, that's definitely things we want to keep an eye on. Also, there's and we don't have a whole lot of time left, there's the homeschooling issue and some of the stuff they do that, even though that's very much independent stuff. Some of the materials out there on that are really scary.
They are, and unfortunately, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on the perspective you have on it, homeschooling is something that we believe that the government should really stay out of. Simply because that is part of the freedom of expression and freedom of education. There are standards for education that should be met. Absolutely, and we believe that it is to the child's disadvantage if they don't meet at least minimum standards for education, for biology, for physics, for things that perhaps some of these homeschool organizations, shall we say, don't go along with standard scientific understanding.
Pretty much we've got, give us just a couple of seconds left. Give me the quick thing on why separation of state is an important factor for us.
Because of freedom. It really comes down to being able to celebrate your religion, for me to celebrate my religion, for somebody who has no religion to celebrate that as well. Because we believe at the end of the day that all laws should have a secular rationale behind them. They should be explainable, they should be justifiable by secular reasoning, because otherwise they get down to interpretation. And there has been a very, very long history in the United States and in the rest of the world of different interpretations of the exact same religious stories, which lead to conflict and lead to violence and lead to, at the very least, a lot of misunderstanding.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. It's been great talking to you about your organization, and look forward to seeing your good work. So,
thanks for having us.
For more information about us, the Humanists of Minnesota, you can go to our website at humanistofmn.org. We'd like to hear what you think about this program, so send us an email or send us a letter. We'd like to hear from you about this program and other programs, and suggest topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Humanist Views. I'm Scott Lohman. Good night.